The rain fell heavily on the streets of Chicago that cold Tuesday afternoon. Inside the old Graham family estate, the grand parlor was filled with people who had come for one reason. They were there to hear the reading of Bernard Graham's will. Bernard had been a successful businessman, a collector of rare books, and a man who had lived a long and quiet life. Now that he was gone, everyone wanted to know what he had left behind. The room was crowded with relatives, friends, and a few business associates. Some people whispered to each other nervously. Others sat stiffly in their chairs, pretending not to care, but everyone cared. They all wanted to know if their name would be mentioned. They all hoped to receive something valuable. Among all these people sat a woman named Ava Brooks. She was a black woman in her early 50s. Dressed simply in a dark blue dress, her hair was neatly pulled back, and she wore no jewelry except for a small silver bracelet. She sat quietly near the back of the room, her hands folded in her lap. She did not speak to anyone, and no one spoke to her. In fact, most of the people in the room ignored her completely. When she had arrived, a few guests had glanced at her with confusion. One of Bernard's nephews had whispered loudly to his sister. Asking who she was, his sister had shrugged and said she had no idea. Another cousin had guessed that maybe she was a housekeeper or a nurse. No one bothered to ask Ava directly. Ava did not seem bothered by this treatment. She sat calmly, her eyes occasionally wandering to the large windows that overlooked the garden. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, the tension grew thicker. Bernard's 3 children sat near the front of the room. They were adults now, each in their 40s or 50s, but they still acted like children competing for their father's attention. The eldest son, Robert, kept checking his watch impatiently. The daughter, Margaret, adjusted her expensive coat and whispered something to her younger brother, Daniel, who nodded and smiled nervously. Behind them sat Bernard's extended family, cousins and nieces and nephews who had not visited Bernard often, but who had suddenly appeared after hearing of his death. They talked among themselves, laughing too loudly and making jokes about old family stories. None of them paid any attention to Ava. At exactly 3 o'clock, the lawyer entered the room. His name was Mr. Harrison, and he was an older gentleman with gray hair and thick glasses. He carried a leather briefcase and a folder of documents. He greeted the family politely, and then took his seat at the large wooden table in the center of the room. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and asked everyone to settle down. The room gradually became silent. He opened the folder and began to explain the process. He said that Bernard's will was clear and legally binding. He reminded everyone that the will had been written several years ago and had been updated just 6 months before Bernard's death. As Mr. Harrison spoke, people leaned forward in their seats. Some looked anxious, others looked confident. Ava remained still, her expression calm and unreadable. The lawyer began reading the first section of the will. Bernard had left his antique clock collection to his eldest son, Robert. Robert smiled with satisfaction, though the smile did not reach his eyes next. Bernard's old photo albums and personal letters were given to Margaret. She nodded, clearly disappointed that it was not something more valuable. The younger son, Daniel, received Bernard's boat, a small sailboat that Bernard had rarely used in recent years. Daniel tried to look pleased, but everyone could see he had been hoping for more. Then came smaller items, a painting here, a piece of furniture there. Each item was given to a different relative or friend. Some people seemed happy, others seemed upset. The room filled with whispers and quiet arguments. Through it all, Ava's name had not been mentioned. Several people glanced at her with curiosity now, wondering why she was even there. One of the cousins whispered to another that maybe Bernard had forgotten to include her, or maybe she was in the wrong room, but Ava did not move. She did not look uncomfortable or embarrassed. She simply sat, waiting patiently as if she knew something that no one else did. Mr. Harrison continued reading. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier. Everyone sensed that something important was coming. They just did not know what. The room remained tense as Mr. Harrison continued reading through Bernard Graham's will. More small items were distributed to various family members and friends. A set of golf clubs went to an old business partner. A collection of vintage wines was left to a neighbor who had shared Bernard's interest in fine drinks. Each announcement brought mixed reactions. Some smiles, some frowns, some polite nods. But as the reading went on, people began to notice something strange. Ava Brooks was still sitting there, quiet and patient. Yet her name had not been called even once. The curiosity in the room shifted to something else. Judgment, Margaret, Bernard's daughter, leaned over to her brother Robert and whispered loudly enough for others to hear. She said she could not understand why that woman was even present. Robert shrugged and said maybe their father had felt sorry for her. Daniel, the youngest son, suggested quietly that perhaps she had been a companion or caretaker in Bernard's final years. Their words were not kind. They spoke about Ava as if she were invisible, as if she could not hear them. But Ava heard everything. She did not react, her face remained calm, though her fingers tightened slightly around the silver bracelet on her wrist. One of Bernard's nephews, a loud man named Gerald, decided to make his opinion known. He turned to the person sitting next to him and said in a voice that carried across the room that it was typical of old men to get attached to their nurses. He laughed and added that Bernard must have invited her out of politeness, but surely she would not receive anything of value. A few people chuckled nervously. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Mr. Harrison glanced up from the documents, his expression neutral. He did not comment on Gerald's remark. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and continued reading. Ava shifted slightly in her seat. She looked out the window again. Watching the rain stream down the glass, her mind drifted to memories of Bernard. She remembered the first time they had met, 7 years ago at a small community library. Bernard had been there researching his family history. Ava had been volunteering, helping organize old archives. They had struck up a conversation about history and literature. Bernard had been impressed by Ava's knowledge and her passion for storytelling. From that day on, they had become friends over the years. Their friendship had deepened. Ava had visited Bernard often, especially after his health began to decline. She had read to him, discussed ideas with him, and listened to his stories about his life. Bernard had no close relationship with his children. They were busy with their own lives and rarely called. Ava had filled that emptiness, but no one in this room knew that. To them, she was just a stranger, someone who did not belong. Margaret whispered again, this time to a cousin sitting nearby. She said she found it suspicious that this woman had spent so much time with their father. She wondered aloud if Ava had taken advantage of Bernard's loneliness. The cousin nodded in agreement, saying that elderly people were often easily manipulated. Ava heard this too. A flicker of sadness crossed her face, but she did not speak. She had learned long ago that some people would always judge without knowing the truth. She had faced this kind of treatment before, being dismissed or doubted simply because of who she was. Mr. Harrison turned another page. His expression grew more serious. He paused for a moment, taking a sip of water from the glass on the table. The pause made everyone lean forward. Sensing that something important was coming, Robert spoke up, asking the lawyer how much longer this would take. He said he had an important meeting later that evening. Margaret added that they had already been there for over an hour. She suggested that maybe they could skip ahead to the main assets. The house, the business holdings, the trust funds, Mr. Harrison looked at them calmly and said that Bernard's instructions were very specific. He explained that the will had to be read in the exact order that Bernard had written it. He added that there was one final section remaining, and it was the most important one. The room fell silent again. Everyone's attention was now completely focused on the lawyer. Even those who had been whispering stopped talking. Ava remained still, her heart beating a little faster. She knew what was coming. Bernard had told her months ago, but she had not fully believed it until now. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat once more. He looked around the room, his eyes briefly meeting Ava's. Then he looked down at the document and began to read the final section. The words he spoke next would change everything. Mr. Harrison's voice cut through the silence like a knife. He held the final page of Bernard Graham's will in his hands, and everyone in the room watched him with intense focus. The rain outside had grown lighter, but inside the parlor, the atmosphere had become electric with anticipation. The lawyer began to read slowly and clearly. He said that Bernard Graham had thought carefully about his final wishes. He explained that Bernard had wanted to ensure his legacy would be in the hands of someone who truly understood him, someone who had shown him genuine kindness and respect. Margaret shifted impatiently in her seat. She assumed this meant the bulk of the estate would be divided among the 3 children. Robert sat up straighter, already calculating numbers in his head. Daniel glanced at his siblings, wondering if their father had finally recognized his efforts. Then Mr. Harrison read the words that no one expected. He said, To Ava Brooks, I leave the entirety of my financial holdings, including all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and trust funds. I also leave her the full rights to my personal memoirs and unpublished writings, along with the authority to manage my literary estate." The room exploded. Robert jumped to his feet, his face red with anger. He shouted that this was impossible, that there must be some mistake. Margaret's mouth fell open in shock, and then she began demanding answers. Her voice rose higher and higher as she insisted that the will could not be valid. Daniel looked confused and hurt. He stared at Ava as if seeing her for the first time, trying to understand what had just happened. The other relatives began talking all at once, some standing, some pointing, all of them expressing disbelief and outrage. Gerald, the nephew who had made jokes earlier, now accused Ava of being a con artist. He said she must have tricked Bernard, must have manipulated a sick old man into changing his will. Others joined in, suggesting that Ava had used charm or deception to steal what rightfully belonged to the family. Through all of this chaos, Ava sat completely still. Her hands remained folded in her lap, though her eyes had filled with tears. These were not tears of joy or triumph. They were tears of grief and memory. She was thinking of Bernard, of the friend she had lost, of the man who had trusted her with his most precious legacy. Mr. Harrison raised his hand, calling for order. He spoke firmly, saying that he understood this was difficult news, but the will was completely legal and valid. He explained that Bernard had updated it just 6 months ago with full mental capacity. Witnessed by 2 independent parties and reviewed by multiple lawyers, Robert demanded to see proof. He insisted that his father must have been confused or under undue influence. Margaret threatened to contest the will in court. She said her family would not stand for this injustice. She turned to Ava and said directly that she had no right to their father's money. For the first time since entering the room, Ava spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. She said she understood their shock and anger. She explained that she had not asked Bernard for anything, that their friendship had been based on mutual respect and shared interests. She told them that Bernard had made his own choices. But her words only seemed to make things worse. Robert accused her of lying, saying that no one gives away their entire fortune to a stranger. Margaret demanded to know how long Ava had been planning this, how many years she had spent working her way into their father's confidence. Mr. Harrison intervened again. He said he had something else to share, something that might help everyone understand. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. He explained that Bernard had recorded a video message. Specifically for this moment, he had known his children would be upset, and he had wanted to explain his decision in his own words. The room grew quiet again. Everyone stared at the envelope in Mr. Harrison's hands. Even in their anger, Bernard's children felt a pull of curiosity. They wanted to hear their father's voice one more time. They wanted to understand why he had done this. Mr. Harrison stood and walked to a laptop that had been set up on a side table. He inserted a USB drive and opened a video file. The screen flickered to life, and there was Bernard Graham sitting in his study, looking directly at the camera. He appeared thin and tired, but his eyes were clear and bright. He smiled gently and began to speak. His voice filled the room, and everyone leaned forward to listen. Even Ava, who had heard some of these words before, felt her heart tighten. Bernard was about to tell them the truth, the whole truth, about who Ava really was and what she had meant to him. Bernard Graham's face filled the screen, and the room fell into complete silence. Even the relatives who had been shouting moments ago now sat frozen, watching the man they thought they knew. Bernard adjusted his position in the chair and took a deep breath before beginning. He started by saying hello to everyone, acknowledging that if they were watching this video, it meant he was gone. He said he hoped they would listen with open hearts, though he knew what he was about to say would be difficult for some of them to hear. His voice was calm but carried a weight of sadness. Bernard explained that he had lived a long life, 78 years filled with success and failure, joy and regret. He said he had built a successful business, accumulated wealth, and raised 3 children, but he admitted that somewhere along the way, he had lost something important. He had lost real connection with the people who mattered most. He looked directly into the camera and addressed his children by name. He told Robert, Margaret, and Daniel that he loved them, that he had always loved them. But he also confessed that their relationships had become distant and cold over the years. He said he took responsibility for much of that distance. He had been too focused on work, too demanding, too critical. But he also said that as he grew older and needed them more, they had not been there. Robert had visited twice in 5 years. Both times to discuss business matters. Margaret had called occasionally, but their conversations never went beyond surface pleasantries. Daniel had sent cards on holidays but rarely came to see him. Bernard's voice cracked slightly as he spoke these words. He said he was not trying to hurt them or make them feel guilty. He simply wanted them to understand the reality of their relationship. He had spent his final years feeling invisible to his own family, wondering if they cared about him or only about what he would leave behind. Then Bernard's expression softened, and he began to talk about Ava. He said that 7 years ago, he had met an extraordinary woman at the community library. He described how Ava had been volunteering there, organizing archives and helping people with research. He said they had started talking about history and books, and he had immediately recognized her intelligence and passion. What began as casual conversations grew into a deep and meaningful friendship. Ava visited him regularly, not because she wanted anything from him, but because she genuinely enjoyed his company. She listened to his stories, shared her own experiences, and treated him with respect and kindness. Bernard explained that when his health began to fail, Ava had been there. She had driven him to doctor appointments when no one else was available. She had sat with him during difficult treatments. She had read to him when his eyes grew too tired. She had cooked meals and made sure he took his medications. She had done all of this without ever asking for payment or recognition. He said that Ava had given him something his money could never buy. She had given him dignity. She had treated him as a person, not as a wallet or a burden. She had reminded him that his thoughts and stories mattered, that his life had value beyond his bank account. Bernard then addressed the elephant in the room. He knew some people would question why he had chosen a black woman, someone outside his family and social circle, to inherit his wealth. He said firmly that Ava's race had nothing to do with his decision, except that it had probably made their friendship even more meaningful. He explained that Ava had faced prejudice and dismissal throughout her life, yet she remained kind and generous. She had worked hard, raised children on her own after losing her husband, and still found time to volunteer and help others. She understood struggle and resilience in ways that his privileged children never had to. Bernard said he had chosen Ava because she had earned his trust and respect, because she had shown him what real compassion looked like, because she had given freely without expecting anything in return. He said his decision was not made out of anger or revenge toward his children. It was made out of love and gratitude toward someone who had truly seen him. He looked into the camera one last time and said he hoped his children would eventually understand. He asked them to accept his choice with grace. He told Ava, wherever she was, that he trusted her completely to honor his memory and use his resources wisely. The video ended and the screen went dark. The room remained silent for several long moments. Some people looked down at their hands. Others wiped tears from their eyes. The anger had not completely disappeared, but something had shifted. They had heard Bernard's truth, and now they had to decide what to do with it. The silence in the room after Bernard's video was heavy and uncomfortable. No one seemed to know what to say or where to look. The truth that Bernard had spoken hung in the air like a thick fog, impossible to ignore. Some people shifted in their seats. Some stared at the blank screen. Others looked at Ava with completely different eyes than before. Margaret was the first to break the silence, but not with words of understanding. Her face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. She stood up slowly. Her hands shaking, she looked at Mr. Harrison and said in a tight voice that her father had clearly been manipulated. She insisted that the video proved nothing, except that Bernard had been lonely and vulnerable. Robert nodded in agreement, though his expression showed less certainty than before. He said that elderly people often formed attachments to caregivers, and that this was a well-known problem. He suggested that Ava had taken advantage of their father's isolation. He said they would absolutely be taking this matter to court. Daniel said nothing. He sat with his head down, his hands clasped together. He looked like a man wrestling with uncomfortable truths he did not want to face. Unlike his siblings, he seemed less angry and more ashamed. Gerald, the loud nephew, tried to rally support among the other relatives. He said the family needed to stick together and fight this injustice. He argued that blood should come before strangers, no matter how nice those strangers seemed to be. A few people murmured in agreement, but many others remained quiet. Clearly uncertain, Ava finally stood up. She had been silent through all of this, absorbing the accusations and the pain. Now she spoke, and her voice was stronger than before. She said she understood their anger and confusion. She said she had never wanted to cause division in Bernard's family. She explained that Bernard had told her about his decision 6 months ago, and she had actually tried to talk him out of it. She had told him that his children deserved his estate, that she did not need his money, but Bernard had been firm. He had said his decision was final, and that he trusted her to do something meaningful with his legacy. Margaret interrupted, asking sarcastically what could be so meaningful about a stranger walking away with millions of dollars. She said that Ava could claim to be humble and selfless, but actions spoke louder than words. If Ava truly did not want the money, she could refuse it right now. Ava looked at Margaret directly and said something unexpected. She said she had considered refusing the inheritance, walking away and letting the family fight over it. But then she had realized something important. She said that refusing would be disrespecting Bernard's final wishes. It would be saying that she knew better than he did about his own life and choices. She continued, explaining that Bernard had not just given her money. He had given her a responsibility. He had asked her to preserve his writings, to share his story, and to use his resources to help others the way she had helped him. She said she intended to honor that responsibility, whether his family approved or not. Mr. Harrison spoke up, supporting Ava's statement. He said that Bernard had left detailed instructions about how he wanted his estate to be managed. The lawyer explained that Bernard had specifically requested that his memoirs be published, with proceeds going to literacy programs and community libraries. He had also established guidelines for charitable donations focused on supporting caregivers and elderly community members. This new information seemed to surprise everyone. Robert asked why Bernard had not simply created a foundation or charity directly. Why involve Ava at all? Mr. Harrison explained that Bernard had wanted a person, not an institution, to carry out his wishes. He had wanted someone with heart and judgment, someone who understood the importance of personal connection. One of the older cousins, a woman named Helen, spoke for the first time. She said quietly that maybe they should listen to what Bernard was trying to tell them. She admitted that she had not visited Bernard in years, and she felt ashamed hearing how lonely he had been. She said that perhaps Bernard's decision was not about punishing his family, but about rewarding someone who had actually been present in his life. Her words created a ripple effect. A few other relatives nodded slowly, acknowledging their own absence and neglect. But Robert and Margaret were not ready to accept this. Margaret said that guilt was not a reason to give away a fortune. She insisted that family was family, and that should mean something. Ava responded softly, saying that family should mean something. And that was exactly Bernard's point. She said that true family was not just about blood or names. It was about showing up, about caring, about being there when someone needed you. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier with truth. 3 days after the will reading, Robert and Margaret filed a legal challenge. They hired one of Chicago's most aggressive law firms, a team known for winning complicated inheritance disputes. Their lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Vincent Caruso, immediately began building a case based on undue influence and mental incapacity. The news spread quickly through Chicago's social circles. Newspapers picked up the story, drawn to its dramatic elements. Wealthy businessman, estranged family, mysterious beneficiary. The headlines were not kind to Ava. Some called her a gold digger. Others suggested she had schemed her way into Bernard's life. The comment sections filled with harsh judgments from people who knew nothing about the real story. Ava found herself suddenly living in a spotlight she had never wanted. Reporters called her phone constantly. Photographers waited outside her modest apartment, hoping to catch a picture. She stopped answering unknown numbers and avoided going out except when absolutely necessary. Her daughter, Jennifer, flew in from Atlanta to support her. Jennifer was angry about the accusations and wanted her mother to fight back publicly. But Ava refused. She said that defending herself in the media would only make things worse. She said the truth would come out in court, and that was what mattered. Mr. Harrison assured Ava that Bernard's will was solid. He explained that Bernard had taken every precaution, knowing his children might challenge his decision. There were medical records showing Bernard's sound mental state. There were witness documents. There were multiple drafts of the will showing consistent intent over time. But Vincent Caruso was not easily deterred. He began interviewing people who had known Bernard, looking for any evidence of manipulation or coercion. He questioned Bernard's doctors, asking if Ava had ever been present during medical appointments. He implied that her presence might have influenced Bernard's decisions about his care and finances. Caruso also investigated Ava's background, looking for anything that might damage her credibility. He discovered that she had filed for bankruptcy 15 years earlier, after her husband's death. He found out that she had worked multiple jobs to support her children, cleaning houses, working in restaurants, doing whatever was necessary. Instead of showing her character and resilience, Caruso tried to paint her as someone desperate for money, someone who would do anything to escape financial struggle. He suggested in legal filings that Ava had targeted Bernard specifically because he was wealthy and lonely, that their entire friendship had been calculated. These accusations hurt Ava deeply, not because she feared they would succeed in court, but because they twisted something beautiful into something ugly. Her friendship with Bernard had been real and pure. They had connected over books and ideas, over shared values and genuine affection. Reducing that to a con game felt like a betrayal of Bernard's memory. Daniel, the youngest son, surprised everyone by refusing to join the lawsuit. He told his siblings that he believed their father had made his own choice. He said that while he was hurt and confused, he could not deny the truth in Bernard's words. He admitted that he had not been a good son in recent years, and he had to accept the consequences. Robert and Margaret were furious with Daniel's decision. They accused him of being weak and naive. Margaret said he was betraying the family. But Daniel stood firm. He said he was done pretending, done fighting over money that his father clearly had not wanted him to have. Daniel did something else unexpected. He reached out to Ava and asked to meet with her. Ava was hesitant at first, worried it might be a trap or a trick, but something in Daniel's voice sounded genuine, so she agreed. They met at a quiet coffee shop away from the media attention. Daniel looked tired and sad when he arrived. He sat down across from Ava and immediately apologized. He said he was sorry for how she had been treated at the will reading, sorry for the assumptions everyone had made, sorry for not being there for his father. Ava listened as Daniel talked about his relationship with Bernard. He shared memories from childhood, times when his father had been present and loving. He also acknowledged the distance that had grown between them as he got older. He admitted that work and his own family had become excuses for not visiting, not calling, not trying. Daniel asked Ava what his father had been like in those final years. Ava's eyes filled with tears as she shared stories. She told him about Bernard's love of poetry, his terrible jokes, his stubborn independence even when he needed help. She described how Bernard had talked about his children often, always with love despite the distance. For the first time, Daniel understood what his father had been trying to tell them. It was not about the money, it was about seeing and being seen, about presence and connection. 4 months after the will reading, the case finally went to court. The courtroom was packed with family members, reporters, and curious observers who had followed the story in the news. Judge Patricia Coleman presided. A woman known for her fairness and her intolerance for drama, Vincent Caruso opened strong for the Graham children. He painted a picture of a vulnerable elderly man who had been isolated and targeted. He brought forward testimony from distant relatives who claimed they had noticed changes in Bernard's behavior. Sudden secretiveness, reluctance to discuss his plans. Caruso presented financial records showing that Bernard had made significant changes to his estate planning after meeting Ava. He emphasized the timing, suggesting it was too convenient to be coincidence. He argued that Ava had systematically inserted herself into Bernard's life with the specific goal of inheriting his wealth. The lawyer called several witnesses who testified about Bernard's declining health in his final years. One doctor mentioned memory issues, though he admitted they were minor and normal for Bernard's age. Another witness, a former housekeeper, said she had seen Ava at Bernard's home frequently and that Bernard had seemed dependent on her. Caruso's questioning was aggressive and personal. He asked about Ava's financial difficulties, her bankruptcy, her struggles as a single mother. He implied that these hardships had motivated her to seek out a wealthy benefactor. He made her sound desperate and calculating. When it was time for the defense, Mr. Harrison presented a very different story. He brought forward Bernard's medical records showing consistent mental clarity. Multiple doctors testified that Bernard had been sharp and decisive until his final weeks. There was no evidence of dementia or impaired judgment. Harrison then presented Bernard's personal journals. Entries written in Bernard's own hand over several years. In these pages, Bernard had written extensively about his friendship with Ava, about how much her visits meant to him, about his disappointment in his children's absence. The journal showed a clear pattern of thought and intention. One particularly powerful entry was read aloud in court. Bernard had written, "Today Ava brought me soup when I was sick. She did not have to. She gains nothing from my company except conversation. This is what real kindness looks like, and I have decided she deserves to carry forward the work I care about most." Harrison also called witnesses who supported Ava's character. The library director where Ava volunteered testified about her dedication and integrity. Neighbors from Ava's apartment building described her as kind and generous despite her own limited means. A woman whose elderly mother Ava had befriended spoke about Ava's natural compassion. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Ava herself took the stand. She was nervous but composed, wearing a simple gray suit. Her hands folded calmly as Caruso approached for cross-examination. Caruso tried to rattle her, asking pointed questions about when she had first learned of Bernard's wealth, suggesting she had researched him before their friendship began. Ava answered honestly, saying she had not known Bernard was wealthy when they first met. She had thought he was just another library patron. Caruso pressed harder, asking why she had not refused the inheritance if she truly had not wanted it. Ava's answer was clear and strong. She said she had considered it, but that refusing would dishonor Bernard's explicit wishes. She explained that Bernard had trusted her with a responsibility, and walking away would be a betrayal of that trust. The lawyer asked what she planned to do with the money. Ava surprised the courtroom by pulling out a detailed plan she had already drafted. She explained that she intended to publish Bernard's memoirs as he had requested, establish a foundation supporting caregivers and literacy programs, and create scholarships for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. She said she would take a modest annual salary to manage the foundation, but the bulk of the money would go toward causes Bernard cared about. She had already consulted with nonprofit experts and lawyers to ensure everything would be done properly and transparently. Caruso tried to suggest this was all a performance, something she had invented for the court. But Harrison produced emails and documents showing that Ava had begun this planning within weeks of Bernard's death. Long before any legal challenge was filed, the final witness was Daniel, Bernard's youngest son. He had volunteered to testify on Ava's behalf, a decision that shocked his siblings and angered them further. Daniel took the stand and spoke honestly about his failures as a son, about the distance he had allowed to grow. He testified that after speaking with Ava and reading his father's journals, he believed Bernard had been of sound mind and clear purpose. He said his father's decision, while painful, was valid and should be respected. He urged the court to honor Bernard's wishes. When Daniel finished, Margaret stormed out of the courtroom. Robert sat stone-faced, refusing to look at his brother. The damage to their family relationships was now complete and visible to everyone. Judge Coleman announced she would take time to review all evidence before making her decision. 2 weeks after the trial ended, Judge Coleman issued her ruling. The courtroom was once again filled with observers, though this time the atmosphere felt different. More solemn and expectant, Ava sat quietly with Mr. Harrison on one side and her daughter Jennifer on the other. Across the aisle, Robert and Margaret sat with their lawyer, their faces showing exhaustion from months of fighting. Judge Coleman entered and everyone stood. She took her seat and looked out at the gathered crowd before beginning. She said she had reviewed all evidence carefully, considered all testimony, and read Bernard Graham's own words multiple times. She said this case had required her to think deeply about autonomy, family obligation, and the meaning of legacy. The judge began by addressing the claims of undue influence. She stated clearly that the evidence did not support this allegation. Bernard's medical records showed mental competence. His journals demonstrated consistent thinking over years, not sudden changes. His video message showed a man fully aware of his choices and their consequences. She noted that while Bernard's decision was unusual and painful for his children, unusual did not mean invalid. She said that elderly people have the right to make their own choices about their estates, even choices that family members find hurtful or incomprehensible. Judge Coleman then addressed the claims about Ava's character and motivations. She said that every witness who actually knew Ava had testified to her integrity. The prosecution's case had relied on speculation and circumstantial evidence, not facts. There was no proof that Ava had manipulated or deceived Bernard in any way. The judge paused and looked directly at Robert and Margaret. She said she understood their pain and disappointment. She acknowledged that Bernard's decision had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their relationships with their father, but she said the court could not overturn a valid will, simply because the results were emotionally difficult. Judge Coleman ruled in favor of Ava. Bernard Graham's will would stand as written. Ava would receive the full inheritance with all its responsibilities and opportunities. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Robert stood and walked out without a word. Margaret followed, her face streaked with angry tears. Ava felt relief wash over her, but it was mixed with sadness. She had never wanted this battle, never wanted to be at war with Bernard's children. She had simply wanted to honor her friend's final wishes. Now she could, but the cost had been high for everyone involved. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Asking for statements and reactions, Ava gave a brief comment, saying she was grateful for the court's decision and committed to honoring Bernard's legacy. She said she hoped that in time, Bernard's children might come to understand their father's intentions. She refused to say anything negative about them. In the following months, Ava began the work Bernard had entrusted to her. She hired a team of editors and worked with a publisher to prepare Bernard's memoirs for release. The book told the story of Bernard's life, his successes and failures, his reflections on family and loneliness, his gratitude for the friendship that had sustained him at the end. The memoir became a surprise bestseller. People connected with Bernard's honest examination of his life and relationships. Reviews praised his vulnerability and wisdom. Many readers wrote to Ava, sharing their own stories of loneliness, estrangement, and unexpected friendship. All proceeds from the book went directly into the foundation Ava had established. The Bernard Graham Foundation focused on three main areas: supporting professional and family caregivers, funding community libraries and literacy programs, and providing scholarships for students who had overcome significant hardships. Ava worked tirelessly, treating the foundation like the sacred trust it was. She visited libraries and community centers, met with scholarship recipients, listened to caregivers share their struggles. She made sure every dollar was spent wisely and with purpose. 1 year after the court decision, something unexpected happened. Daniel reached out again, asking if they could meet. This time he brought someone with him, his teenage daughter Sarah. Daniel explained that he had been talking with Sarah about everything that had happened, about Bernard and family and what really mattered. He said that Sarah wanted to volunteer with the foundation, to learn about her grandfather's legacy through action rather than inheritance. Ava was moved by this gesture. She welcomed Sarah warmly and put her to work. Over time, Sarah became a regular volunteer, and through her, Ava got to share more stories about Bernard. 2 years later, Margaret surprised everyone by making a donation to the foundation. It was not a large amount, but it came with a note in careful handwriting. Margaret had written that she was trying to understand what her father had been teaching them. She said she was sorry for the pain she had caused. Ava never heard from Robert again, but she often thought about all three children, hoping they would eventually find peace. She knew that Bernard had loved them despite everything, and she tried to honor that love through her work. Bernard's legacy lived on, not in buildings or monuments, but in changed lives, in supported caregivers and educated students, in communities brought together through literacy and learning. Ava had taken what Bernard gave her and multiplied it into something beautiful. She had proven that she was exactly who Bernard believed her to be, someone worthy of trust, someone who understood that true wealth is measured not in what we possess but in what we give away.